But the president's Ukraine policy, just like the Israeli policy, should be debated. We should talk about it. We should discuss it. We should separate the costs and benefits and analyze them as distinct policies, because that is what the American people deserve of their legislature. Now, there are many questions we could ask about the Ukraine policy, many issues that have gone completely unanswered. Number one, what is our end goal in Ukraine? You hear commonly that the goal is to throw the Russians out of every ounce of Ukrainian territory, and yet when you talk to the president's own administration in private, they admit that that is a strategic impossibility. Let me repeat that. No rational human being in the president's administration believes that it is possible to throw the Russians out of every inch of Ukrainian territory. So why is that the public justification offered by many advocates of indefinite, unlimited Ukrainian aid? Because this debate is fundamentally dishonest. We are not telling the American people the truth because we know that if we did tell them the truth, they would not support an indefinite flow of money to Ukraine.
Well, let's talk about someone who is new to the Republican Party, at least in office, J.D. Vance, who was picked by Donald Trump to be his vice president. Well, what do you make of that choice? What are your thoughts on that choice?
I mean, they are celebrating that choice both in Milwaukee tonight and in Moscow. Like, J.D. Vance is the one that has said, I frankly don't care what happens in Ukraine. He has very loudly talked about how he doesn't care what happens in Ukraine. He has opposed aid to Ukraine at a time where, since World War II, the biggest defense of a country, of freedom, that is happening right now. I mean, in the trenches in Ukraine, you have somebody that is a musician next to a machinist, next to a college professor. These are people that are not at all have anything in common except they're standing together defending their country. And all we have to do is help to finance that, right? We're not even fighting. And J.D. Vance has aggressively parroted actual Russian talking points. So this, to me, he is a guy that was an anti-Trumper, that all of a sudden is the biggest pro-Trumper. He has no moral soul, no center, and how you can like Russia and what they're doing in Ukraine is beyond me. I think it was a terrible pick for the president.
Okay, so let's talk about J.D. Vance. So we all been dissecting him, looking at his history, looking at his previous speeches. People have been talking about some of the great things about him, and obviously some of the opposition is talking about some of the worst things about him. But what I want to focus on today is the warmonger aspect. We have a lot of neocons in the GOP, and I'm so glad that Trump didn't pick someone like Nikki Haley to be his VP. A lot of people were advocating for Nikki Haley. A lot of people were advocating for Tim Scott. And my biggest problem with those two is the fact that they are warmongers. They don't mind printing money and sending it overseas so poor people can die, because at the end of the day they get paid. Nikki Haley worked for Boeing, making millions of dollars off the military-industrial complex. They have this George Bush era Republican-style mentality, just like the current Democrats, where we can sit comfortably at home and continue to print money, hurting our own economy, causing inflation at home, and at the same time causing deaths of hundreds of thousands, even millions overseas. So one of the best aspects that I like about J.D. Vance is the fact that he is not a warmonger. He's been getting criticized for it because he's been speaking out fiercely against sending endless money to that cokehead over there in Ukraine, Zelensky. So J.D. Vance is being extremely realistic about the war in Ukraine. He understands what's going on the ground. He understands that America lacks the surge capacity, the industrial base needed to sustain years-long wars against pure powers. The United States doesn't have it. The United States industrial might has been gutted and sent overseas. All the production is in Vietnam. All the production is in China. United States is threatening to go to war with China, but at the same time, all the United States stuff is made in China. Doesn't even make sense. It's not like in World War II, where the United States had the strong industrial capacity, all the steel, all the vehicle parts, everything was made in the United States. Everything needed for a real war was already here, able to be quickly produced in the United States. That's been gutted, gone for decades. So the United States military right now and the United States economy is built for war profiteering. It's built to go beat up some third world countries, Afghanistan, Libya, somebody like that. It's built to do shock and awe and take over Baghdad in 6 weeks against a weak-ass military over there. It's not built for years-long wars against pure powers like Russia and China. There's no capacity. It takes years and years and years and an insane amount of money to produce a ship, to produce missiles, to produce tanks, stuff like that, things that you would need. It just costs way too much money in the United States because they're getting rich off of it, and it takes way too long. So in a pure war, United States will find out quickly. Even right now, the United States is trying to supply Israel, trying to supply Taiwan, trying to supply the Ukrainians, and it's unable to adequately do that. And the United States itself is not even engaged in these wars. And Israel is not even fighting its main enemy, Iran, yet. So if these wars escalate, the United States will find out quickly just how tough it is to fight pure powers without an industrial capacity. So that's what J.D. Vance is trying to get at. He's trying to say this is dumb, this is stupid, and the Ukrainians have no chance of winning at all anyway. So the only thing happening is a bunch of Ukrainian men are dying, hundreds of thousands of them are dying. The war profiteers, the military industrial complex, they're getting filthy rich out of it. And we're just wasting time, wasting lives. So I like that about J.D. Vance because, again, he's not a warmonger, but he's been under fire for it. He's been criticized. Oh, you hate Ukraine. You're pro-Putin. Trump selecting J.D. Vance as his running mate. Oh, they're celebrating in Moscow about this. Because these people want to keep funding a lost cause war, sending hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian men to their deaths. Now, Israel, his stance on Israel, that's a different story. He's one of these typical Republicans bought and paid for by Israel, by AIPAC, pro-Israel lobby. He did the dance for the Israelis, and of course he supports unlimited funding for the Israelis. And some of my biggest disagreements with J.D. Vance are going to be about the unlimited, undying, unconditional support for Israel. But that's just not a Vance issue. That's with the Republican Party as a whole. Not to say that I support Palestine either, because between Palestine and Israel, I'm neutral. Just like Russia and Ukraine, I'm neutral. I'm purely America first. Even when it comes to these foreign lobbies like AIPAC, even when it comes to the military industrial complex trying to keep funding so they can get rich out for wars overseas. I'm neutral on that. Let's spend our money at home, the little money we have, because we got $34 trillion in debt. But let's spend our money at home, not in Israel, not in Ukraine, not in Taiwan. So let's go ahead and react to this short interview right here from J.D. Vance. He's going to give us his thoughts on the American proxy war with Ukraine and Russia. And like I said, he's been taking heat for it, especially now that he's announced as the running mate. People are digging into it and seeing all of the things that he said over the last year and a half or so about Ukraine and Russia. And a lot of people crying and bitching about it. So let's listen in.
Open up this process again, or where are we?
Well, I do think the president has to get involved and show some leadership here. If you think about the political dynamics, Republicans sort of disagree on the Ukraine question, but are unified in our belief that we need stronger border security measures. The Democrats disagree on the border, but are unified in their belief that Ukraine needs to get a lot more resources. I think that actually creates a real opportunity for some negotiation, but unfortunately the president has to participate in that process.
Can you kind of clarify where you are on the Ukraine endgame? I've seen comments attributed to you suggesting you'd be okay with Ukraine giving up some percentage of its territory in a peace negotiation. Talk a little bit about what that looks like.
Well, I think if you look at how mismatched the militaries are, there's really no pathway to peace that doesn't run through some negotiation. I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm not saying it was good that Russia invaded Ukraine. I'm not saying it's good that Ukraine has to give up territory, but they have made no significant progress despite hundreds of billions of dollars of American aid.
I've been saying this for, 2 years now? No matter how much money America prints and sends over there and forces the Europeans to do the same, it's not going to work.
Is another $100 billion really going to accomplish anything, or will it take Ukraine further down the pathway of becoming effectively a dependent of the United States of America? My worry here is that the country is effectively being destroyed. The average age of a service member in the Ukrainian army is now 43 years of age. They can't pay their pensioners. If this goes on another year, are we dealing with a country, or are we dealing with a rump state that depends on America indefinitely?
What message do you think that sends to, let's say, Taiwan? That if you get invaded and you can only last a year or so, if you can't win in a year, you got to give up 20% of your country.
No, look, I think, first of all, Taiwan is a much different priority for America than the Ukraine is.
Why do you think that?
Well, in part because they produce such critical economic ingredients of our own economy that if Taiwan was taken over by China, it would give the Chinese even more leverage over the United States.
At least he's being honest. See, somebody like Nikki Haley, these other neocons, they will say, oh, Putin's a murderer. They will say, oh, Putin, he's going to take over Poland. Then he's going to run into the Baltic states. Then he goes to take over Germany. Next thing you know, Putin will take over the entire world. So they continue with this lie and tell the American people we need to print money. We need to prioritize the Ukrainians. If you live in an economic hellhole, damn you. We need to send money overseas. Because Putin is mean and Putin is evil. But this guy is honest. Look, Ukraine is not a priority for the Americans. Taiwan is, Ukraine isn't.
Whereas I think Ukraine, obviously it's an important country, it's just not nearly as important to America's core national interests as Taiwan. I think the lesson all of us should take away, the Taiwanese, the Ukrainians, but most importantly American policymakers, is we do not have the industrial base to support multiple conflicts at once. You already see evidence that we're taking shipments of weapons that were planned for Israel, diverting them to Ukraine, or planned for Ukraine and diverting them to Israel. The takeaway from this conflict is actually that America needs to build more of its own weapon systems. And while we're rebuilding that industrial base, we can't pretend we can fuel 3 conflicts at once. We just can't.
One more thing,
Sure.
because I think it speaks to the other argument. I've seen attributed to Zelensky that he talked about the idea that if Ukraine loses this war, you'll have a migrant crisis of their own right in Europe. Is that a European problem? Did anything in that line of thinking affect your thinking on this at all? That you could have a huge displacement of people again if Ukraine fully loses this war?
Well, it's actually hard for me to imagine Ukraine losing much more people to migration. I think they've already lost close to 25% of their country. This is a country that had 40 million people, now has 28 million people. Most of those people have been refugees to western parts of Europe. I don't know how the migrant crisis could get worse than it already is. And it's not just Ukrainian migrants, but it's also the food crisis in Africa that's putting tremendous pressure on African food prices because they get so much of their wheat and grain from Ukraine. I actually think if this thing goes on much longer, you could not just have a Ukrainian migrant crisis, you could have a full continental migrant crisis, and it's one of the reasons why I'd like to bring this thing to a close.
Exactly. Bring this thing to a close, something that the military-industrial complex doesn't want to do, something that the neocons don't want to do. What did they tell the American people when they sent that $60 billion over there? They said, well, this is creating jobs in America. We're sending money to fuel a war where hundreds of thousands of people are dying. But hey, look, we're getting jobs out of it. And the neocons, the politicians, they're getting filthy rich. The high-ranking individuals in the military-industrial complex, they're getting billions of dollars. They're getting filthy rich off of it. So let us print money, cause inflation in America, cause deaths overseas, and we'll get paid. Not you, normies, but the people in charge, the politicians and the CEOs. They'll get filthy rich. So J.D. Vance is saying, look, what's the point of this, man? Yeah, y'all getting rich. People are dying, but we're not getting anywhere with this. There's no way in hell for Ukraine to do anything against Russia. We sent all this money over there. Hasn't driven out the Russians at all. Let's adjust our priorities. Let's stop printing money. And if Russia takes Ukraine, that's not our problem. Now, America had a lot to do with the start of the war. The Americans helped run a coup against a pro-Russian government in Ukraine 10 years ago. But at this point, it's a lost cause. There's nothing the United States can do to get the Russians out of Ukraine. If the United States goes over there to try to fight Russia itself with its own military, then it's going to go nuclear. So there's nothing you can do about it. The Ukrainians aren't good enough, even with all the American money, the Ukrainian military, with the U.S. training, the U.S. tactics, the U.S. money, the U.S. advanced weapons, whatever. With all of that, the Ukrainians have zero effect on the Russians. And like I said, if the Americans were over there to try to fight themselves, first of all, if it was conventional, the Americans would run into surge capacity issue in this industrial base, like Vance is saying. But it'll just go nuclear anyway, and we'll all be dead. But that's just to end this conflict. There's nothing left to do. Stop printing all the money. Why don't you focus on the American people? And I say that even with Taiwan, why don't we focus more and make it more of a priority, make the microchips at home, and not have to worry about going to war with China, which is probably not going to happen anyway because the United States is way too economically entwined with China to begin with. I think there's a lot of fear mongering going on with that type of war, and that whole Israel thing. Like I said, that's a different video. Don't even get me started. So let me know what you guys think about this. What do you think about Vance's stance? Do you like the fact that he's not saying Russia, oh, Putin is bad? Or do you think we should continue to fund the war in Ukraine? Let me know what you think. Leave me your thoughts in the comments below. Share the video. Thanks for watching.